Welcome to the Sleep is a Skill podcast. My name is Molly McLaughlin, and I own a company that optimizes sleep through technology, accountability, and behavioral change. Each week, I'll be interviewing world-class experts ranging from doctors, innovators, and thought leaders to give actionable tips and strategies that you can implement to become a more skillful sleeper. Let's jump into your dose of practical sleep training. Welcome to the Sleep is a Skill podcast. My guest today is Dr. Jay Wiles, and he has actually served as my own personal HRV coach and consultant. And I'm really excited to have him share his wealth of knowledge on this topic of heart rate variability, HRV for short. And I know it's an area that many of you, whether longtime listeners to the podcast or part of our weekly newsletter, small groups, one-on-one clients, etc., this topic of HRV tends to be a really popular one because it can be so confusing and so all-encompassing on the many aspects of our health and what it takes for us to be able to really recover. Since we know that HRV is really this metric of recovery, it really can help us underscore a lot of what's working or it's not working as it relates to both our health and of course our sleep. So we're going to get a little bit deeper with Dr. Jay today, and I'm really excited for what he's bringing out to market. And I mentioned in the podcast that I have no financial affiliation to what he's bringing out, but it's really exciting, and I'm definitely going to be one of the first people to test this out, which is this new product around HRV. Now, it should be available for pre-order at the time of this podcast being aired. And so you can definitely check out more about that at hanuhealth.com. But a little bit more about Dr. Jay in the meantime. Dr. Jay has a passion for helping others reach their full potential from an integrative and holistic perspective. He completed his Bachelor's of Science degree in psychology from North Greenville University and went on to complete a master's in clinical counseling at Columbia International University with a strong passion for integrative and holistic care, especially in nutrition and psychophysiology. Now, Dr. Jay completed his Doctor of Clinical Psychology degree at Regent University with a specialized focus and concentration in the health psychology space. Dr. Wiles then furthered this specialty in health psychology as a pre-doctoral intern at McGuire VA Medical Center in Richmond, Virginia, and postdoctoral fellowship at WJB Dorn VA Medical Center in Columbia, South Carolina. Now, Dr. Jay currently works as the only board-certified biofeedback specialist in South Carolina with dual certifications in biofeedback and HRV biofeedback. And as I alluded to, he's got something really exciting coming from Hanu Health. Hanu spelled Hanu, hanuhealth.com. And it's going to really have some possibilities or potential to kind of shake up this area of HRV and also help us to make sense of daytime HRV tracking. Now, why are we talking about all of these things around HRV as it relates to sleep? Well, many of our longtime listeners and for those of you new to this conversation, what even is HRV? It can really give us some insight into, if we're looking at nighttime HRV, the quality of your sleep throughout the course of the night, and of course, as it relates to your health. And daytime HRV, while it may be a bit more noisy because you have a lot of variables throughout the course of the day and a lot of kind of expenditures on you, whether digestion, movement, talking, standing, walking, etc. There still are things that we can kind of learn by getting connected to these numbers and then shifting gears in our behaviors, which is, of course, what we're really passionate about over here at Sleep is a Skill, is how to shift your behavior to improve your results with your sleep and also really your overall nervous system, how you're able to get a handle or a hold on your ability to kind of calm your nervous system at will, because that's going to play in tremendously with your results with your sleep. Now, without further ado, let's jump into the podcast. All right, you all, I'm so excited to announce our new sponsor, Soul CBD. When I was at my lowest point dealing with my insomnia, CBD was one of the key compounds that I leaned into to combat my crippling anxiety, calm my nervous system, and support my journey to entrain my circadian rhythm. But of all the brands out there, where can you go that you can have a strong trust in their quality? Well, Soul CBD is completely THC-free, organically farmed, gluten-free, and third-party tested for toxins. Now, one of the things that is great about Soul is that they aim to help create rituals around your CBD use. and sleep and rituals are best friends. For instance, I love that Soul CBD supports a nighttime bath routine with their CBD bath bombs, which help to combat stress, soothe aching muscles with a mix of CBD essential oils and dead sea salts. Another ritual that we aim to cultivate in the realm of sleep optimization is circadian rhythm intermittent fasting, which is really all about eating your meals between sunrise and sunset. And Soul CBD has very popular gummies that can serve as a nighttime dessert or treat to look forward to without caving to ice cream. Nice alternative. My go-tos personally are their oils, capsules, topicals, and even CBD bath bombs. It's helpful for anyone who struggles with anxiety, pain, or sleep. Now, particularly when I'm traveling, I like to lean into as many things as possible to help with inflammation, and CBD does just that. Now, here's a really cool part. You get 15% off automatically and free shipping when you go to mysoul.com/sleep is a skill. I'm going to say that again. You get 15% off automatically. All you have to do is go to this link, which will be in the show notes, mysoulcbd.com/sleep is a skill. All right, let's get on to the show. And welcome to the Sleep is a Skill podcast. I could not be more excited for our guest today, Dr. Jay Wiles. Dr. Jay, you've become a good friend, and I really, really value your opinion on all things HRV. You are really my go-to expert in this area. So the fact that we've been able to snag you in the midst of all that you're up to right now is really, really exciting. And so we've got lots of questions to dive in, but thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, Molly, thank you. Likewise. I mean, it's been great to develop this relationship. You and I have so many common interests, work with so many, a lot of the same clientele, and then sleep and HRV are so much interconnected with one another. So I couldn't be more excited to talk to you today.
Yes, yes. And I don't even know if you know this, but I have been so in love with your new podcast. It's just been incredible. I highly recommend that people listen to it. When we got busy lives, we don't always have the opportunity to listen to all the things we want to listen to, but I really try to prioritize your podcast. It's pretty much yours. And I know you're a fan of Andrew Huberman, as you've been sharing.
Yeah.
So you two are right up there.
Man,
so
if I'm on the same list as Andrew Huberman, oh man, that touches the heart. My man crush of Andrew Huberman. I like that.
Right? All right. See, this is going to be a good podcast.
Indeed.
All right. So anyone listening, be sure to subscribe to Dr. Jay's podcast, the Hanu Health podcast. And we're going to jump right in because we got a lot of ground to cover. So first off, though, wanted to have you share a little bit about how in the world you became this real expert, like the expert in HRV.
Yeah, it's funny because it's an interesting story because I just kind of happened across it. It's actually how it happened is I wasn't necessarily searching. I just came across it. And the way I came across it, so just a little bit of my backstory. So I'm a clinical health and performance psychologist. And one of the things we have to do, very similar to medical residents, is that we have to do a residency, which is a year-long intensive training. And then afterwards, you can specialize as like a postdoctoral fellow. And I did my residency at with the Department of Veteran Affairs in Richmond, Virginia. And while working there, I was actually working on a rotation in a pain clinic, but this was a very unique pain clinic in that they took a very holistic and integrative approach. They're actually called the VIP Center, or the Veterans Integrative Pain Center. And the intention here was to provide something that was alternative or maybe even too adjunctive for these veterans who are looking to decrease pain experience or pain subjectivity, but also reduce or titrate off of opioid-based medications, which is a really large-scale problem within the veteran population. I mean, it's a large-scale problem anyway, but especially highly prevalent amongst veterans. And so this clinic was very unique in that it was truly holistic and integrative. We included things like acupuncture. We had things like mindfulness groups. We had guided imagery meditation. We had nutritional psychology. We had chiropractors. It ran the gamut. It was an amazing experience for these veterans and very different than what they were used to, which was really incredible. The other thing, though, that I didn't mention, which is how I came across this, is we had what was called a biofeedback clinic. And for me as a health psychologist, I was loosely like aware of what biofeedback was, but I didn't have the depth or purview to really understand the complexities that went into biofeedback. And at first, just I started shadowing, and I shadowed one of these biofeedback clinicians, and he was running through. He had everybody hooked up to all these sensors, like they had sensors on their fingers and on their shoulders and on their necks, and everything was being monitored. All of these data points were being captured. And initially, I just kind of walked in. I was like, "What is going on here?" And they explained to me, well, we can actually have a good representation of a person's subjective pain experience and their stress response by monitoring certain physiological variables. One of them just so happened to be this thing called heart rate variability. And I, again, had never heard of it. So I was like, what is this concept? And we can obviously dive into the concept of heart rate variability, but the short story is that I started seeing that when these individuals within this clinic would engage in biofeedback and would train utilizing heart rate variability, they were suddenly getting better. They were reducing their pain subjectivity. And we published a lot of papers when I was a resident on this, just on the efficacy of reduction of pain subjectivity, which if anybody's not familiar with that term, that's just kind of our feelings of how we feel pain. Pain is very subjective. We can rank it, but from a 0 to 10 scale, somebody's 7 on a pain scale could be the other person's 2 because it's so incredibly subjective. But we started seeing those numbers go down. It was incredible. And, I will have to say it was likely a combination of biofeedback and other modalities that they were engaged in. But a lot of people attributed heart rate variability biofeedback as a key reason as to why they were experiencing kind of these significant changes in pain subjectivity. So for me, my interest was so piqued because for me, I've always been very analytical, science-based mindset. Like I love numbers, I love data, I love objectivity. And so I was like, okay, let's crawl down this path, which led me to studying the field of psychophysiology, which is the interconnection between psychological processes and physiological processes, that bi-directional relationship. And then heart rate variability was just something that there was so much literature out there. And again, like you don't really know until you start digging a little bit. And even since then, I mean, now that's, well over a decade ago, the amount of research on HRV has just skyrocketed. And it's predominantly due to kind of its accessibility in almost all wearables out there. But it was just led to one thing after another. It was kind of one of those ideas where you're passionate about something and you just continue to dig and dig and dig and research and research and research until you just know a lot about a little. And that's my claim, right? It's like, I love health and wellness, but I'm not necessarily like a jack of all trades. Like I know a lot about a little, like, which is heart rate variability. So yeah, that's why I'm here. Just a lot of studying, a lot of work with, thousands of patients now, which is crazy to look back on. And heart rate variability is my thing.
Amazing. Yes. And I was lucky enough to be one of the people to work with you along the way as well, and learned a lot so far, and eager to even continue. And from that place, I think then it would be great to even hear, what is heart rate variability? And this is, a sleep podcast. So why are we even talking about this in relationship to sleep?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me actually respond just really quickly to the second question first, and then open up heart rate variability.
Beautiful.
The reason why it's so incredibly important is because it's so accessible. And you see a lot of these wearable applications. For instance, like I've got Oura Ring, I've got Whoop, I've actually got Garmin on right now as well. And then I've got Hanu right here, which we can talk about here in a little bit. Yeah, indeed.
Exciting.
But the thing is that we have accessibility to this data, and everybody pretty much right now is capturing HRV. And for Oura especially, I mean, Whoop does run off of a platform of using HRV in their recovery score, but Oura it's a significant variable that's also factored in with sleep architecture and sleep staging. So I think that it's really important for many reasons. But one thing I just wanted to highlight before I talk about a more operational definition is that it's accessible. I mean, people are really able to get this at a relatively inexpensive price, because it was previously that if you wanted to get heart rate variability and get it, at least semi-accurately, or if not really accurately, you would have to put on electrodes all over your chest and it's so dang uncomfortable. So now that you can throw something on your wrist, throw something on your finger, like it's way better than having to do that. So I just wanted to mention that.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah. And I think that's why people are starting to really, as you said, get so in this conversation, because it's just that daily feedback that's so fascinating. So yeah, I'll let you share more about what that feedback is.
Yes. And, one of the great things about heart rate variability is that it's very easy from an operational definition, but it is super complex.
Yeah.
The field of psychophysiology and how heart rate variability falls into that subject matter is very dense. It's very granular. And so one of the things that I try not to do is like get too deep too fast. I like to just set the stage with a really easy to understand definition. And the actual definition of heart rate variability is found within the phrase itself, variability of heart rate. And that's really what it is. So it's looking at the difference in time and how that varies in between successive heartbeats. So I really like to paint this picture in easy to understand terms. Most people are very familiar with this idea of heart rate. So you can put on heart rate monitors everywhere, right? Like my Garmin's checking heart rate. I mean, even Aura is now, collecting heart rate data continuously, and so is Whoop. People are familiar with heart rate. So if we take, for instance, 1 minute, which most people realize equates to 60 seconds. When you say, let's look at your heart rate monitor and it says 60 beats per minute, then that means that your heart beats 60 beats per that 60 seconds, which would then equate to an average of 1 beat per second. Now, that is an average, and that would be correct to say on average, your heart beat once every second. But the problem with that is that's actually not the way heart rate works. That's not the way our cardiovascular system works. Indeed, there's actually, and there should be, immense variability in between successive heartbeats. And I'll explain kind of why that is here in a second. But the myth, though, is that there's not these consistent times in between heartbeats. The heart doesn't operate like a metronome. If the heart operated like a metronome, which it will for some people, that's actually a vast sign of detriment to the heart, and I should say degradation of the heart. The reason being is because the heart will begin to pace itself when it's under extreme duress or distress. And so that could be from a cardiovascular event. It's actually a warning sign if somebody's about to have a heart attack, which I should say to people, like, don't get nervous too then and think like, oh, because my heart rate variability is dropped or so low, I'm now about to have a heart attack. That's not the case. There are a lot of other variables there that we can explain, but we know that the heart will pace itself as a metronome in order to adapt to the environment, because it's basically like, I don't know what else to do other than to regulate right now in order to create some level of inner homeostasis. However, that's, again, not such a good thing. But what we do see in a normal, healthy heart, and then also someone who is really adaptive and resilient to stress, we see a lot of variation between heartbeats. And the reason this happens is for multiple reasons, but the primary reason is because your heart rate changes or should change significantly across the respiratory cycle. So there's a process called respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And what occurs is when you inhale, your heart rate is actually going to increase. And the reason it increases is because that's the opportunity for us to utilize and deliver oxygen throughout all muscular tissue, including the brain. So when you inhale and we take in oxygen, it's delivery time. It's time to get the heart pumping and deliver oxygen around. So the heart rate increases as we inhale. Also, too, from a neuroanatomy standpoint, when we inhale, the lungs expand, obviously, which actually compresses the heart. And when the heart feels like it's under more distress because the lungs are pressing and it shrinks and concaves, then it beats faster because it doesn't have as much room to expand. Now, on the opposite end, which would be our exhale, the heart should starkly and significantly decrease. So what that does is that creates more space in between successive heartbeats and increases heart rate variability. We actually know that when we exhale, that's actually us applying pressure onto our vagal brake. And our vagal brake is our 10th cranial nerve, or our vagus nerve, and it allows the parasympathetic nervous system to fully engage. So across that respiratory cycle, we should see significant change in heart rate variability. However, there are reasons, whether it be cardiovascular, cardiorespiratory, or from a stress-based psychological perspective, that we can see heart rate variability limit or even kind of significantly reduce. And again, we can talk about the reasons why that's good and that's bad here in just a second. But when we start to see that, then we know that there's some level of dysfunction at the autonomic nervous system level. Because in the end, and I tell people to this, and then I'll be quiet because I know I tend to jab.
No, I love it. Keep going.
Right. Will do. The one thing that I tell people is that HRV is a data point, right? What is it actually? It's a proxy. It is a proxy that allows us to examine changes in the human stress response, but even more specifically, changes in the autonomic nervous system. And I think that's the key point, right? Is because so many people are like, I want to raise my HRV, or like, I have a low, quote unquote, low HRV. And I always ask people, like, what does that mean? Well, they're like, well, I heard you should have a higher HRV, or I heard I shouldn't have a low HRV. I saw your Instagram post where your HRV was up there and mine's nowhere near yours. And I'm like, okay, let's take a step back. And then I'll provide the explanation that I just provided you.
Yes.
So it gets a lot more granular than just high, low, or even this idea of balance. We have to be a lot more specific in providing a definition.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you said that, because actually that was one of the first things I wanted to get out of the way, is that because I know that that's probably your most routine question that you get. Certainly I'm hearing that a lot as people are examining their sleep stats. So at least in what I'm in my conversations, that will be one of the first questions is mine so bad? It's 25, it's 42, it's whatever. Mm-hmm. So just to further underscore there, if you can share, is there any validity for people comparing, even if they're trying to like search to find information of like normative ranges and different charts and graphs and all of these things? Is that worth the time, energy, and effort? Or what's your framework for thinking about that?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. The reason it's so fantastic is because you are correct. The most requested question that I have is, like, is my HRV okay? Is it too low? How do I raise it? Those are like the three that I get all the time. Yes. And I think that it's a very valuable question, right? Because in so many other metrics, like we have a comparison, right? So like we have these like cutoff scores. Let's think blood pressure. Let's think even ranges of heart rate. Let's think about BMI. All of these things, sleep architecture is even one, right? People like, you should have, right, quote unquote, like these numbers that we meet. And, there are there's some good research that would indicate that like there are some markers that we'd like to hit, but HRV is not one of them. There's not like, okay, well, everybody should strive for X number. It's not there. There is technically normative scores that we could compare to when it comes to HRV. Here's the thing though, and this is what, like the huge caveat, the only time in the literature where it has ever been indicated, and this could change, right? I mean, I love how evolving we are in science and in research, but to this point, as we record this, in February of 2022, there is no research that has indicated any use for a normative comparison other than in looking at cardiovascular health that is after someone has had a heart attack. So we actually know that cardiologists will utilize heart rate variability as a very valuable biometric to help predict overall heart health, but also more so, I should say, predict potential future cardiac events. So if someone has had a myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack, then what we can actually use is a gold standard HRV metric called SDNN. It's the standard deviation of normal beat intervals. It is typically used as a 24-hour measurement. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well. Most of what we talk about in my world is short-term, 2 to 5 minute, even 1 minute measurements. But these longer 24-hour measurements, and what we actually know is that we can use those scores to compare from a cardiovascular standpoint, from a normative standpoint as well. So I that's the only time. So the better answer, because that is a very, very small number of people, unfortunately in the older population, it's a much larger number. But for many of the people, that follow me on my podcast, I'm sure on yours, I'm assuming most people have probably not had a heart attack. And so those numbers are not as important. And most people aren't taking 24-hour readings and looking at their SDNN markers. So that's my long-winded way of saying, there really shouldn't be a normative comparison. What we're really looking at are changes and even more particularly trends in our baseline scores. And we're also comparing on a number of metrics. And I think this is one of the major pitfalls and downsides of a lot of our wearables is that it provides you with a singular metric. It gives you one metric of HRV, which is almost kind of like, just taking the lens and putting it in almost like a microscope mode, whereas we can actually pan out and see a much greater picture if we utilize some other variables. Now, the good thing is that most wearables do utilize the best metric out there for looking at HRV, which is RMSSD. And I can talk about that here in a second.
Sure.
But the problem is that, again, people miss the point because that's all they see. And then all they're doing is comparing normatively to the people they see on Instagram or their friends or, whoever they're on the Facebook Aura group or whatever. Like I used to, a couple of years ago, I was a part of like the Facebook Aura group, and I would see people like comparing their scores, and I was like, I'm out of here. Like, and I would start to like type something, and I'm like, don't be a keyboard warrior, just get out of here. So,
I definitely know what you're talking about. Anyone listening to, there's some great Facebook groups for information or to see what other people are up to for different wearables, Whoop, Aura, what have you. Mm-hmm. And just as great as it is to have people talking about similar things, there can also be some kind of not to use a buzzword of misinformation, but bit of misinformation on those. So yes.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Indeed. Okay. So then from that place, so how do we begin to make sense of this? Assuming then we're all coming from this perspective that we don't want to necessarily compare. We're looking for our own baseline, and we've established our baseline where we're 40 or whatever the number is. Mm-hmm. Then from that place, what are some of the ways for us to even make sense of the wearable data that we might be getting? Like for instance, throughout the course of the night, are there certain things you would like to see with a healthy HRV? Is there a pattern? Is it a downward slope, an upward slope? Is there things that you're really on the lookout for with some of the consumer grade wearables?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first thing to realize in assessing this level of data is to realize that HRV is fed by a lot of variables. And what I mean by that is there are so many things that factor into HRV. The first one being is that when we can utilize HRV as a great biometric for recovery, for sports performance. And so that's the one that I use a fair amount with a lot of clientele who are working more from like a physical health coaching wellness perspective, is they're saying, okay, how can I use this for my wellness and recovery, and knowing like either how hard I can push it, how much I'm overtraining or overreaching. And the reason being is because when we engage in exercise, which is a great thing for us, when we do overtrain, then it's very taxing on the nervous system. And remember, as I said earlier, this is a great proxy for nervous system functioning.
Yeah.
So the autonomic nervous system, especially when it's been beaten down so much from an intramuscular standpoint, from a hormetic stressor perspective, it can turn from this nice hormesis or phase of hormesis into a much more allostatic load. And that's a term that's used when our perceived resources are so taxed by our experience of the stressor that we do tend to not function at a higher level of performance. So when we experience that too, and that's aside from psychological stress, somebody's HRV could be tanked, and they may not have a ton of psychological stress, but they're experiencing this immense amount of physiological stress. So I mentioned that to say like that's a variable, but then the other variable is that somebody might not be engaging in a ton of physiological exercise or exertion. However, their nervous system is getting beaten down by psychological stress and by all of these internal and external stressors that they experience in the day. It could be their commute, it could be work, it could be relationships, it could be finances. That's a really big one. All these things chip away at our nervous system. We have this vagal withdrawal, the parasympathetic nervous system disengages. And then when things get really extreme and tough, or they build up over time, the sympathetic nervous system's really engaged and the gas pedal's down. You're burning both ends of the candle. And then next thing you know, HRV is tanked. So, and then, the double whammy is people that are overtraining and they're overreaching, and then they're also really psychologically stressed, and they got, a high load of inflammation that's also taxing on the nervous system. And so HRV drops. So a lot of it is really doing some searching and seeking and testing the waters, if you will, on assessing what are those things that are really driving you towards that state of allostatic load. And then once we identify those variables, which is where Hanu is going to come in, and I know we can jump into that here soon, is really kind of tracking, like, what are those things that are the main contributors to my nervous system being so taxed? Once they do that, then we can start to then do more of the reparative work. Then we can say, okay, well, what can I do to better my response, my resiliency to stress, whether it's physiological, psychological, relational, spiritual, you kind of put your thing in there. Knowing what to do with it is going to be key. So self-awareness and self-regulation is what I always teach. But, kind of to your question that you asked, like, really, what should we be looking for? Well, the first thing is kind of knowing your numbers, like establish that baseline, because you need to know where you start. And a lot of people ask me, and I've asked plenty of other experts in this area too, because obviously I'm not the only expert in HRV. But a lot of people who work with our company have been consultants. They've provided some really great responses to this. I've asked, okay, so like how long does it truly take for us to know our baseline? And it varies. What I love is that it varies for most people, which is not the sexiest answer in the world.
Yes.
However, we do see trends in about 3 to 5 days. So we can kind of really get an established baseline. But there are some nuances to that, right? Let's say like you're trying to establish your baseline of HRV, and on one morning you take it first thing in the morning, you haven't done anything yet, like you take your reading, or like you just look at your Oura ring score, and then the next day, in order to take your reading, like you had a cup of coffee, and then your kids are yelling at you to get out of the door, and like you're late for work also, and then you're like, oh no, let me take my reading. We're comparing apples and oranges now. So consistency is really key. So that's one thing to remember too. And I can kind of get more into like a protocol here in a little bit, but I just wanted people to know, like, if you are going to establish a baseline, and maybe this is the teaser for that, then it has to be some consistent readings, and it's about 3 to 5 days. If you're just using one metric, and this is going to be a lot of people right now, right? It's Oura Ring, or it's Whoop, or it's their Garmin, or even Apple Watch, I believe, captures overnight HRV as well, which there are some that are better than others. And I can talk about that too. But one thing to really keep in mind here is that if you only have one metric, that's okay. Like you can compare that. Just make sure that when you do it, you know what you're looking for. And here's what you should look for. So let's use Oura for an example, because I know that's just a really popular one. When you wake up in the morning and you look at your readiness score, it gives you an overnight continuous reading of RMSSD. RMSSD is the root mean of successive squared differences, which is a mouthful and nobody needs to understand, but that's a mathematical equation that has taken all of the RRI intervals, which are the time spaces in between heartbeats, and it has transformed the data to give us an average of the data by squaring the root mean, which again, no one needs to know the math behind this. But what this helps to do is give a really good representation of what is happening within our parasympathetic nervous system, or maybe even more so, a great representation of what is happening with overall vagal modulation. Now, this is a great score, but how should we look at it? So let's say somebody wakes up and they have a 50 one day, they have a 50 the next day, and a 50 the next day. Okay, their baseline is 50. Let's go ahead and establish that. Then the next day after they take their reading, it's down at a 20. Well, that's a significant difference. And most people can say, okay, well, we've cut it, in half. More than half. Like, what does that actually mean? If it's one day, it may not mean a ton. It could, but it may not mean a ton. But if you wake up the next day and it's a 20, and you wake up the next day and it's a 20, and your baseline is a 50, your nervous system is really taxed. It could be overtraining or overreaching. It could be a really psychologically demanding time. It could be, and this is a great segue to sleep too, that you have been getting really bad sleep that has completely wrecked your nervous system. This is, again, where we have to do a little bit of the detective work, and we have to kind of, get out the, pickaxe and the eyeglass and start looking around a little bit, because identifying those trends is key, because then we need to make change. So it starts to get complex, and it starts to get a little bit more granular. And this is why, again, I think that it's really important not to just look at one single HRV variable. It can be done, and there's certainly value in that. But I also think expanding the horizon to see a little bit more of the granularity of that data can be important as well.
Absolutely. And I know you've mentioned in the past some kind of basic guidelines around how to think about those drops. And so do you still abide by that thinking? Does that still work? Is that anything we can share with people, like certain percentages drop on like what to do?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So when you peruse the literature, there is a bit of a disconnect, like in regards to like, how can we make a lot of this data practical? However, there are some semi-consensus that I can share with you. And there are things that we are building into, our application at Hanu as well, that I can speak to as to kind of the why and what's the research behind it. So we know that a reduction in HRV, especially a significant reduction, is one that is absolutely a flag, right? It's a warning sign. Like it is there to signal a level of awareness. And it's a great thing that we have. We don't want to just say that we rely completely on HRV. Like we actually want to also have that marrying of subjectivity with objective readings. However, the objective readings also provide a lot of help as well. They're great for convincing us of one way or another. And I'll come back to that here in just a second. But the kind of the general rule of thumb that I've provided in the past, and I think is still quite useful, is that when you check your HRV in the morning, look for certain percentage drops of your baseline to better inform you. Don't allow it to be a self-fulfilling prophecy and say, well, it's there. This is the rule, and then this is the rule that I will always abide by, and I'll never do anything differently. It's more a time for you to check in than it is anything. And so I've softened my view a little bit on that. I used to be kind of hardcore. It's like, if you've dropped a certain percent, then, do X, Y, Z. But in general, it's about 20% of a drop in HRV. So say your baseline is 100 and you drop down to an 80. That's a general flag, a little warning sign to say, hey, kind of check in, like, something's a little bit unusual, but not that unusual. Like your nervous system probably just kind of took a beating. And we can see this sometimes with, people who are intensely working out. It's kind of a sign like, something's going on, but it's not necessarily like, hey, stop everything. Like you need a rest day, like you can't do anything type thing. It's just like hey, check in, alert. If you're like squatting that day and you start to feel some like, tingling in your knees, like pull back a little bit because you're a little bit more prone for injury because your nervous system is so taxed. 40% of a drop. So say it's a 100 and you drop to a 60, that 40% is where the red flag is really up because that's an unusual drop. 40% is pretty taxing. And especially if you see it compound, like if you see it one day, it's like, ooh, okay, check it. You see it 2-3 days, yeah, something's going on. And generally, that's when there's a high level of inflammation. The nervous system is super taxed. It could even be that you're sick. So when people are getting viral illness or if they've got COVID-19, a lot of people, it's manifested in this really stark drop in HRV. So that's one of the times where I say, okay, like, your nervous system's not telling you right now that it's a great idea to go out and do a Metcon or to, run 15 miles today. Like, again, I've tried to soften my view and say, it's not saying like, again, you should just completely rest and be sedentary, but it is saying like, you really, like your body's telling you something. And for most people, when they take their reading and they get a score that's 40% below their baseline, the bulk majority of people that I've talked to, they will say like, I subjectively, like they just felt tired that day. Like even prior to checking, they just felt like a little bit more on the fatigue side. Maybe they were having mental brain fog. Maybe they were really stressed. It tends to marry pretty well, that subjective and objective score.
Okay. No, that's so helpful. And then from that place, on the flip side, for a little added motivation for people, I do have some clients that they'll start to notice these patterns where some of the big heavy hitters, the alcohol, the certain late night foods, and all the things that you'd certainly see, that they begin to know, which is fantastic, that those will hit their numbers. And yet they're missing the motivation to do much about it per se. So they might say, listen, I'm not that interested in a number, so I'm going to keep my red wine, or I'm going to this and the other. So I'm curious if you can share, if people are to really take on this area of their life to really up-level some of these numbers, what can they expect to see? Say, they really make a measurable improvement in their baseline. What are some of the reasons why that would be valuable for them? I'm sure it echoes into many areas of well-being, but what are some of the main top heavy hitters?
Yeah, the top thing is that when you are aware of what is causing detriment or taxation to the nervous system, then you can make change to those things that are causing taxation, right?
Sure.
So whether it's alcohol, it's overtraining, it's, relationships, it's your boss, whoever it may be, once you become self-aware of it, then we can start to make changes. The intention of identifying what's causing us taxation in the nervous system is then to use it to build resiliency of the system. So what I always tell people is that HRV should always be viewed through the lens of either how something is causing you to be less resilient to stress, physiological or psychological. And then as we raise it and we increase it, then that's our opportunity to enhance resiliency to stress, physiological and psychological. So the goal here too is, again, to find like, what are those replacements? What are those things that we can use as training mechanisms to enhance overall resiliency to stress? Because we know that stress comes in so many forms. It's different for everybody. And it's one of those things that, again, if we could truly build that level of adaptation and resiliency to stress, then we're going to be better human beings in general. We're going to be healthier. We're going to be more optimal from a cognitive perspective, from a mental perspective, physiological perspective, and then just better humans. We're going to be less emotionally reactive to people. Like, that is such a cool buy-in, to not like feel like you need to yell at your coworkers or your kids or, your spouse or whoever anymore. Like, it's a really cool thing to have. So, and there are many things that we know are super detrimental to our nervous system, like overconsumption of food, especially late at night, as you know, obviously not great for sleep, but it will tank HRV.
Yeah.
Like, if I generally go to bed. I sound like such an old man, even though I'm not old. I go to bed generally around like 9 or 9:30 at night, but that's because I'm like a 4:45, 5 a.m. type of person.
Yeah.
I wake up and I'm ready to go. If I eat, probably I'd say like 2 hours before bed, like within that framework, like between 7 and 9, if I eat anything, it completely like will wreck my sleep. My HRV is tanked. Yep. So it's one of those ones that I tell people, like, that's a really easy one. Just like 2 hours before bed, like, stop eating, like, just fast for 2 hours and then allow that to kind of be, and that's going to be different for everybody. But for me, like, that's just always been like a go-to. So food and overconsumption of food throughout the day as well. Like, we know too, there's been studies that have been done that have looked at people like when they engage in really heavy, like calorically dense, but also like high carb, high processed foods, like high, like really bad fats, like polyunsaturated, linoleic acids. When they engage in that type of meal, especially like lunchtime or dinner time, and it could be breakfast as well, is that we see that heart rate will stay up much longer. And then that also equates to significant decreases in HRV and longer time for the nervous system to repair itself and get back to normal. And the reason being is because the third branch, which is not known to a lot of people, but the third branch of our autonomic nervous system is actually our enteric nervous system. It's our gut. So we can actually tax our nervous system by eating really poor food and eating too much food. So that's one that I always say. Yep. And you mentioned alcohol. Like, I am so cool with people like consuming alcohol in whatever way they want, especially if they do it, that if it fits their lifestyle. But like, if people want to improve their overall health and nervous system functioning, and we see that they're overly consuming an alcohol, it's such low hanging fruit to make some level of adaptation. I'm not asking people to take away, their nightlife or give away the things that they really like. But like, if that is an important area for them to have better stress resiliency and adaptation to stress, that is a must. The other really big one, kind of coinciding with it, is THC.
Yes.
So, THC is a huge one. So there's this interesting study that came out that I'm doing a review on video for Hanu that looked at THC in low dose consumption and then in moderate and high dose consumption. And it looked to see what it did to HRV parameters, more specifically the frequency domains of HRV, one of them being the high frequency band, which is a great proxy for parasympathetic nervous system functioning. And what they found is that when people were consuming like a quote unquote moderate dose of THC, about 7.5 milligrams, and then when they were consuming what they considered in the study a larger amount, 10 milligrams of THC, they saw a stark drop in HRV, not just transiently or acutely, but chronically the more they used it. So again, I don't want people to give away, the things that make them happy and the things that are, legal wherever you live. But what I will say though, is like, if nervous system functioning and optimization is super important to you, that's one that people really need to be cognizant of and they need to be aware of.
I so appreciate you saying that one because I think that's such a tricky area that often we might think is actually something that's really serving us and it's a healthy alternative. And of course, this is case by case basis. Some people are dealing with acute pain management and lots of things to consider. But purely if we're from the conversation of HRV and cause and effect, it's something that I see over and over again. I wasn't aware of that study, which is awesome. So thanks for sharing about that because I don't think a lot of people don't realize that one.
Yeah, well, what was really interesting about that study too, obviously they were looking at parameters of the autonomic nervous system, but they also looked at subjective anxiety. And they
Mm,
saw that as people's HRV lowered, especially their HF, their high frequency band, anxiety was out the roof. It
yeah.
always increased. And what was that highly correlated with? Consumption of THC. So if
Yes.
someone, I've kind of gotten to the point now where I'm like, if you know you have high levels of anxiety, and you're looking to optimize health, I can't recommend THC. And which is,
Yeah.
again, a little bit like counter to what people think, right? They're like, oh man, I smoke a little bit, or I like, ingest an edible. And maybe for me, like it just mellows me out. The research doesn't agree with your anecdote. That's
Yeah.
anecdata, as Huberman would like to
Yeah,
say.
there you go.
So it's one of those things like as a scientist, I can't argue with that. And I see it too in my clinics in the past, like people who were experiencing high levels of anxiety and they would try to mask it with, THC or cannabis, and it didn't really have the effect that they would hope for, especially the longer term effects. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, one of the last questions before we get into some of the protocols that you're doing for your own sleep and health, one of the last things, because selfishly, I definitely want to get you back on again, is what from a philosophy, just for even people to come from a place of a strong why on really taking this area on and belief that they can change it. Because I have a lot of people that say, oh, mine's just stuck. I can't move it. And, I've kind of given up on it. I'm just curious if you can even share from your experience of how kind of some success stories of people actually being able to shift their baseline. Is this possible? Is it a short-term thing? What does that look like?
Yeah, I love this question because that is, again, one of the things that people ask me about all the time is like, can I improve this number?
Yeah.
The research and then my work with clientele, but I like that, again, that's anecdata. The research demonstrates that this is absolutely available to everybody to be able to increase their overall HRV. I think though that people start with that as a lofty goal though, and that can be a little bit problematic. They're like, okay, so what can I do to raise my HRV? Like over time, that baseline? I don't think it's a bad question to ask, but I think it might be the wrong question to ask initially. And this is what the research has really demonstrated, that it's not the baseline of the score of HRV that is nearly as effective in interpretation as it is on how much you can modulate HRV in the moment. Because what this actually means is that if you have really good control and volition over your nervous system, you tell it to do what you want it to do, to rev up when you need it to rev up, because again, like we don't want to demonize stress. We don't want to demonize, the sympathetic nervous system. Then that's great to be able to control that. But also on the opposite end, can you also pump the brake? Are you able to engage the parasympathetic nervous system and engage the brake? And it's those mechanisms of control that are far more important. How does that actually manifest? That manifests in you being able to monitor and watch, let's say, a continuous capture of HRV via something like HRV biofeedback. Can you, with your will and your breathing, increase HRV over the course of 30 seconds or a minute? And how well can you do it? How high can you do it in the moment? How fast can you do it? These are way better indicators of your ability to control your autonomic nervous system and enhance stress resiliency than your overall baseline score. But the great thing is that the more and more you practice those types of things like biofeedback, and again, I'm just going to shamelessly plug Hanu. I mean, this is what we're just going to ask you this. Building.
Yes, please.
This is what we're building. We're building a means for you to test that. Number one, for us to monitor, well, really for our device to monitor you at all times, continuously, whenever you're wearing it, monitor your heart rate variability, your heart rate, your nuanced changes in the nervous system, and then provide you with feedback. We'll actually alert you by saying, looks like compared to your baseline, things are a little bit out of whack. And then we can help you train through breathwork mechanisms, through HRV biofeedback. And again, we train resiliency over time by continuously training. And what we see, and again, this is research, and then from my experience as a clinician, is that we see that the more and more that people practice this type of practice, the increases in baseline HRV occur. And there's other things as well, too. Like there are ways to quote unquote hack it. I mean, there's obviously obviously some really great exercise protocols that I recommend as well that we may not have time to talk about today, but hey, on the next podcast.
Yes, exactly. The what to do.
Indeed. But there are definitely mechanisms for doing this. But in the research, there are two things, and maybe we'll even have this as a teaser for the follow-up podcast. There are two things that have been identified in the research that have clear evidential data that state that they are effective for increasing heart rate variability and decreasing stress load, increasing resiliency to stress. The number one, exercise. Exercise is so incredibly important. And that's finding a good happy medium. And in the literature, and then also from personalized experience, it's this great combination of resistance training or strength training combined with something like lower intensity cardiovascular exercise, or what might be referred to as zone 2 training, which are both kind of like my go-tos. And then also intermixing some HIIT training or high intensity interval repeat training can be quite important. But what I will say though, is that someone who has a really overly taxed nervous system, I never recommend HIIT or HURT type training, because that even taxes the nervous system even more. And if they're not repairing very well or recovering very well, we can actually cause a lot of damage. So I tell people to watch out. So we can get granular on those two things on that. But I don't think I mentioned the second thing though, which is so exercise. And the other thing is biofeedback. So heart rate variability biofeedback, which is basically a high-tech way to leverage breath work. It's amazing. I mean, it's amazing stuff. And there's so many great published studies in blue ribbon peer-reviewed journals on the efficacy of biofeedback. And that's really what our platform at Hanu is built on. It is built on incredibly accurate continuous monitoring of your stress response throughout the day, alerts so that you can then track what are the things, where are the places, like how is stress affecting me? And then one of the best platforms you're ever going to see, I think, I'm biased, and one of the best platforms you're ever going to see for training. So we're closing the loop. We're providing you with amazing information and data, but that's kind of useless if you don't know what to do or you don't do anything about it, right? So it's like, I love Aura and Whoop, and these are great companies. Like, I hope they don't come after me for saying this, but these are great sources of information. What do you do about it? Like, that's what we want to know. We're going to be that company that is always there with you, monitoring your stress. And we're always going to have a solution that's going to help you acutely. And over time, it's going to help you to build resiliency to stress. So there's my elevator pitch.
No, I so appreciate you sharing that, because honestly, I'm seeing a lot of different pieces of wearable and different pieces of tech that are coming out all the time, things forecasted, things available now, et cetera. And there are few things that I'm as excited about coming out, because I really, truly believe that by leveraging a metric like this, it can absolutely change lives. I'm particularly biased around more the mental health side of things, in alignment, of course, with overall health, but I think it can be particularly really powerful for people that a lot of the people I'm working with that are dealing with numbers of stressors throughout the course of the day and into the night, and it's impacting their sleep. And they, by virtue of having something to point to in this objective world, black and white, that kind of signifies a bit of what they're dealing with internally, then to be able to then absolutely learn that they have a say in that response and actually train for that. And that it's not just they're kind of stuck with this reality. I think it just can be so life-changing. So grateful for what you're working on. Can't wait for more. And anyone listening, by the time that this comes out, you should be able to go right on over to it's Hanu Health, right?
Yep. HanuHealth.com. And the pre-order will be up. You'll get to see the explainer video that will show you like all of our technology. You'll be able to access and see all the screens of the software that we use. I mean, it's just a beautiful design and it's practical. Like what we wanted to do is balance the provision of amazing, like quality data, but then also just make it practical and usable and like not confuse people. So there's always ways to learn about what we're doing, because heart rate variability is very confusing. Like we didn't get into all the domains of heart rate variability, but it's really confusing and granular. And it's a lot of language that most people aren't familiar with. And you don't really need to be familiar with. So within our application, both the hardware and software, we just make it so when we set out to make this company, we said we want to make it so easy that our grandparents could use this without problem. But provide so much valuable and great information that the biohacker, the health optimizer, is going to fall in love with it. So we are so pumped.
Amazing. Can't wait for more. So really, really exciting stuff. And to that point, kind of the laser round, if you will, 3 questions. So it's personal to you because anyone that's coming on the podcast, often people want to know, well, what are they doing for their sleep? So I know you just did a great podcast too, running through kind of your whole day. So highly suggest people listen to that because you got lots of things that can help influence their HRV and test out. But for your evenings, so the first one is, what does your nightly sleep routine look like right now? And I'm sure this is adjusting and changing just like a lot of ours, but what do you got going on now?
For sure. Yeah, it does change, but it hasn't changed a ton in like the last probably 6 to 8 months. And the reason being is because I did so much stuff for sleep that and spent a lot of money and a lot of time, probably too much money, too much time. I'm trying to figure it out. But that's the nature of biohacking, health optimization. It's like we're immersive journalists and we're going to try and we're going to self-quantify. We're going to see what works and what doesn't. And so I think I've kind of dialed in a pretty good routine. But one of the things that I mentioned on my podcast about the daily routine is that for me, like sleep always starts with like prep. Like everything I do prior to getting in my bed, like is what establishes a great framework. But what I will say, and this is my caveat to that, is that if for some reason I get derailed and I can't do everything that's a part of my, so-called routine, it still doesn't typically like negatively affect my sleep because I've got 2 kids and a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and they can be crazy at night. And so there's all these little wild cards that occur. So I try to give myself a little bit of grace, but for the most part, I have a pretty good dialed in routine. Like I mentioned, I go to bed really early. Well, early compared to most people, I feel like. I mean, 9:30, 10 is the absolute latest. Like if I stay up past 10, my brain is just like mush because I get up at 5, every single morning. My body's just so adjusted to that. But the first thing for me is generally like when the sun goes down, we have it in our house that we have like automated the lights to also go down. So everything is dimmed with the sun. So right now, I mean, it's very dark here because, it's raining outside, but here, in the wintertime, I guess that's I guess it goes down around like 5:30 or so, 6. So we're already dialing down the lights. By the time I get to 7 p.m. or so, which is generally when we put our kids down, the room is so dark where my wife and I are at that it's almost a little tough to kind of see around. Like it's not pitch black and it's not like, it sounds maybe a little bit more tense than what it is, but it's pretty dark in there. And we have amber lights. We dial them way down. And so that's like number one. And that happens every single night, kind of like basically on a timer. The second thing that I'm always doing is I'm always settling the mind and the body by not engaging in anything overly stimulating. So for me, I generally will try my best. Sometimes I can't, but an hour is the minimum, but generally 2 hours prior to bed, I try to get away from any type of like media or phone or screen. And it's a lot of times a great opportunity for my wife and I just to catch up on the day. I do some reading, like I just try to ease the brain. And, if I use media, maybe I'll listen to a podcast or some soothing music. Like I've really like tried to protect that time and to protect my eyes. Because we don't use a ton of blue light, like in the evenings. Like I don't wear my blue blockers as much as I used to. Sure. And, it's one of those things too, that I think I've found benefit in the past, especially like with red lenses. Like I use my raw optics, like it'll help me to get sleepier. But I can't put them on too early because then I'll find myself just like wanting to go to bed at like 7:30. So I'll intermix those. Then I have like a supplement routine. And this is not an every night type thing, but it's maybe 50% of nights. Might just depend on like if I'm kind of like, oh, maybe I could use a little bit of a crutch like to help with sleep. Sure. I do a combination of magnesium 3 and 8, apigenin. This is, again, I'm going to mention Huberman. This is like Huberman's cocktail.
Yes.
It's magnesium threonate, apigenin, and then it's L-theanine, and I'll take some of that, and that's kind of a good just like chill out cocktail that will help me like really with latency probably more than anything, but also I stay asleep pretty well with that, and then I'll drink some reishi tea prior. Then when I go upstairs, some nights I'll do like my Juve infrared light panel. I typically like to do that in the morning, but I will do it at night because I haven't found it to like significantly affect my sleep in a negative way. But then the other thing too is that my room is dark. It is cold. And like it is set up to where like when I enter into the bedroom, like it is, the lights are normally red. We turn our LEDs on to red. And I know people are probably going to get on me for the LEDs, but I like that we can kill the light. We can set the light to whatever tone, but I know people are going to yell at me for the flicker. Anyway, all the biohackers.
All the things.
I know.
I know.
Things.
Yep.
Indeed. And then it's really cold. I mean, by cold, generally 67 degrees or so. So we keep it nice and chilly. I used to sleep with an Uller, with one of like the chili pad Ullers. I just had some like, and again, this is nothing against the company. Like I love it. They sent me one, so I don't want to like rag on them. It's just it was really loud. And then also too, I could feel like the little ripples like in the Uller pad itself. So it's just kind of uncomfortable, but I did love just like the way it felt.
Well, a little heads up for anyone listening too, that has had that experience, because I've heard that they do have something coming. So, get excited.
That's cool. And then for me, I'm generally going to do about 5 to 10 minutes of breath work or meditation. So I do a lot of breath work that includes long exhalations and long breath holds. So breath holds generally around 15 to 20 seconds. So pretty lengthy breath holds. And then that just helps to calm the nervous system, establish a good framework. And then I tell people too, like my wife and I truly use the bed for two things. It's sleep and sex. Like we don't do anything else in that bed. Like we don't watch any TV. Like we do our best to not even like check phones. Like my phone is on like sleep mode, like by the time I go to bed. So no alerts or anything coming through. Throw on my Manta mask, which I absolutely love.
Yeah, they're great.
And then I'm asleep.
Amazing. Oh, that's such a great answer. So helpful. So fantastic protocols for the evening. And then what might we see on your nightstand? And could even be your proverbial nightstand, like traveling or what have you, apps or gadgets or anything, but anything that we would see physically?
Oh, interesting question. Well, the one thing that you will see, and I didn't mention because this is a very like important part of my night routine, and I didn't mention it, is that every single night I put on two things other than my face mask.
Yeah.
Nose strips. So I wear the Breathe Right, like sensitive strips, but also mouth tape. Every single night I wear mouth tape. I use my buddy, Patrick McCune, who co-hosts Hanu Health with us, all the Q&A episodes. I use his tape called myotape that goes around the lips. And so instead of like actually pressing on the lips to where you can't talk because it seals the lips shut, this one just goes around the lips, closes the lips together. And I love it because I can still talk to my kids if I need to, or talk to my spouse. It's a phenomenal one. So you'll see those on there. And then other than that, it's like on my nightstand, it's very just bland.
Minimalistic, which is often lamp. Great.
You'll see a lamp. That's it.
Fantastic. I love that. And the nose strips, actually, I'm happy you mentioned that because a lot of people aren't mentioning that. And you consistently really use that. It's not just when you're having allergies or any sort of flare-ups. You're always
every night. And I don't know if it's necessary per se, but I mean, I do feel like it opens the nasal pathways pretty well. And for me, it just like assures that like I'm getting great oxygenation during the nighttime, especially with my mouth tape on. And so I've just gotten to where like I started using it and then, it seems like it's great. And so I'm just going to keep on buying it.
Yes, totally.
Take my money, Costco.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that one. And then the last one would be, what has been the biggest change to your sleep game or biggest kind of aha moment as it comes to your relationship with your sleep?
Oh man. Okay. I definitely have an answer for this.
Okay.
And this has been an absolute game changer for me. The game changer is maybe not like the quality of sleep, let's say, or even the duration of sleep. It's actually how I come out of sleep. I think this is the most important game changer to me. I used to be one of the ones who had, the iPhone alarm that would go off and it would jar me awake. And I'd be like, oh, what the hell's going on? And it's like so scary, like to me in the morning. And I have completely changed to where I do not utilize any sound. I only use haptics. So Whoop has haptics built into it to where like at 5 a.m., it'll gently wake me up. It's funny because like I still technically use it, but I almost always, I'd say 90% of the time I wake up like right before it goes off. My body's so attuned to it.
Love that.
My body just naturally wakes up, which is how I prefer. Yeah. I keep it on there as a bit of a crutch because like I've got stuff I want to do. So like I need to get going. In an ideal world, I would, go to bed at 9:30 or 10 and just naturally wake up without it. But because I have such a regimented schedule, I still use it to help me wake up. So I either use that on my Garmin or I'll use it on my Whoop. And it has been a game changer for me because for me, I have two rules. Like the rule is that I only wake up like with haptics. And the second rule is that I never, ever, ever snooze ever. Like I do not. And actually, I don't even think there is a way to snooze with like my Whoop, which is kind of cool. I tap it twice and then I get up. Yeah. It's like that David Goggins rule. It's like once the alarm goes off, like if you snooze, like you're going to screw like the rest of your day up, like you already could. So for me, it's just get going. So yeah, I don't know. That's probably a minor thing, but it has been great. So great.
I think a lot of people, even with the Whoop, don't even realize they can do that too, especially with the new one. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. And the way that you wake up, it's someone so attuned to your nervous system. I mean, that's such a fantastic way to set the day. So great answer. And to that point, is there anything we did miss and how can people learn more about you?
Yeah, no, indeed. I think that the one thing for people to consider, and again, maybe this will be for the next podcast that we get in, is that like, I have found that if you really want to calm the nervous system down to enter into a great stage of sleep or a state of sleep, and you want to decrease the latency or the time it takes or the onset of sleep, is that really like engaging the nervous system via some form of breath work or meditation or HRV biofeedback with your Hanu band. It's so incredibly important because if you're carrying the day's baggage with you and you haven't turned off the mind and the body and you try to get in bed, you know how it works. Like, man, my mind will continue to go. And I have found myself, even with breath work, the little chatterbox still going off. And my go-to every single time is just to get out of bed. I have a little pillow over in the corner and I just engage in some breath work for another 5, maybe 10 minutes max. And I get back in and I will do that repeatedly until, and I haven't done that now in probably 2 years because I've become so accustomed to it. But I think that's just my last thing.
I appreciate that.
Do it.
It's such a powerful tool. Fantastic. Yeah. And I know people listening, because I know this was such a teaser episode. There's a few episodes where I'm like, no, I want more time. But with that, I know people are going to want to learn more. And I absolutely encourage people to check out the Hanu Health. I'm, no financial affiliation. And yet I absolutely am so excited about this product. And if anyone was confused, it's not as if this is a competitor to any of the wearables. It can really work in conjunction with any of the wearables you might already have, because many of us that are listening, or many of the people listening, might have a lot of different nighttime trackers for their sleep. And that can inform us. But this is going to be something in addition that we're using all throughout the course of the day to really actively shift those numbers. So just for clarification, and how can people learn more about what you got going on?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I do that, that's a great clarification, right? Because most of these wearables, they have some stuff built into it for tracking throughout the day, but they're really, good at monitoring sleep when someone's at rest. Whereas our algorithms and the great hardware that we use are really monitoring you throughout the day. And the intention is that we are a stress resiliency company. You could even say like a mental health wearable. Yes. We are hardcore about that. So we're not trying to step on the toes of anybody else. No. We are a stress resiliency wearable. But to find us, there are a couple of ways. So if you're looking for a lot of the content that I put out, which is nowadays very much just like Hanu, on Instagram, I'm at Dr. J Wiles. On my website is drjwiles.com. And then Hanu Health is at Hanu Health on Instagram, Twitter, whatever, Facebook, all the other ones. We also have a YouTube channel. So you can find Hanu's YouTube channel now, which is amazing. If you want to watch all of our podcasts, the educational videos, a lot of kind of the how-to videos as well on heart rate variability, stress resiliency. We're on YouTube. We have our podcast, Hanu Health Podcast, which you've been featured on as well.
Yes,
so everybody needs to go listen to our episode where you're the featured guest talking about all things sleep as a skill. And then hanuhealth.com. That's probably the best place to go because that's where you'll see our products. You'll be able to pre-order. And I will say too, it's my shameless plug. Anybody that's pre-ordering right now, the first 1,000 people that pre-order, they're going to get this device 40% off. So we're selling it retail for $300. So still under all of our quote unquote competitors in the wearable space, still cheaper even at a retail price, but we're going to sell it for $180 to all those who pre-order. And you only have to put $30 down until we actually get to market, which is going to be like in around the July, August frame. But get in early. That's the best way.
Oh, that's fantastic. We'll mention that in our newsletter too, for people to kind of take advantage of that. That sounds incredible. Well, Dr. J, thank you so much for taking the time. I so appreciate it.
Indeed. Thanks so much, Molly. I look forward to the next time as well.
Yes. Amazing. You've been listening to the Sleep is a Skill podcast, the #1 podcast for people who want to take their sleep skills to the next level. Every Monday, I send out something that I call Molly's Monday Obsessions, containing everything that I'm obsessing over in the world of sleep. Head on over to sleepisaskill.com to sign up.